What can you learn from Rory McIlroy's recent swing changes? Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is how he's made those swing changes. And I think this is really, really important and where a lot of amateurs go wrong. In his interview, Rory talks about, well, actually, let me just put it up there.
That I wasn't going to watch my ball flight for 3 weeks, lock myself indoors, just in like a swing studio for 3 weeks and just hit balls into a blank screen or a net. And just focused on my swing, focused on the movement of my swing, focused on some of the body patterns, I guess, and just had a live feed on a TV in front of me of where the club was and get the reps in of making the motion that I want to make. And then that's the only way that I'm going to make a swing change, because if I just hit balls in the range, I'm just going to react to whatever ball flight I've just seen. So to not see the ball flight for a while, I think has been really important.
So you can hear Rory talk about that, how he didn't want to be influenced by the ball flight. What he's saying is he doesn't want to try and make changes, see the ball, and then be despondent with the result. So what he did is he locked himself away in a studio. Obviously, we don't all have a studio, but a lot of us have access to nets, or even at home practicing in a mirror. What that allowed him to do is work on the fundamental movement patterns without being influenced by hitting the golf ball and responding to strike and direction. What that does is when we take away the outcome goal of seeing where the ball flight is, it just makes it a little bit easier to make changes. Now, this is a concept popularized by like Dave Alred. Many of you might not know who Dave Alred is. He did a little bit of work with Luke Donald when he went to world #1. He also did work with England rugby team when they won the World Cup. And his big emphasis on technique changes a lot of the time was doing this sort of movement pattern without outcome goals really related, just to allow those changes into technique to actually like get real results. The problem I see with most amateurs is they start changing, see that they get a little bit worse, and then they revert back to type. Now, that's not beneficial for your golf game. So a lot of the times, a lot of pros, we realize that it takes sometimes a couple of steps backwards to go like 3 or 4 steps forward. So you'll see that with a lot of guys where they're not really focused on what's happening. You can learn a lot from that. And I think a lot of amateurs need to embed that in when they practice, of not being aware where the ball flight is. So that's first thing, really, really important. Probably more important what I'll show you from what Rory's technique is, because obviously this will apply to some golfers, probably apply to a lot actually, because a lot of golfers have this problem. But that if you take nothing away from this video, look at that learning of not practicing, trying to hit it to a specific target as such when you're embedding swing changes, or not to be too concerned. Obviously still do a little bit of work on outcome, but if you're embedding in changes in technique, something like practicing a net can be very beneficial. Let's have a look at what he's doing differently in his technique. What Rory has an issue with is his right arm at takeaway gets a little bit out of position. Rory gets a little bit too stretched out sometimes. He can sometimes whip it a little bit inside or outside. This year, what he's been doing is getting a little bit too straight armed here. This right arm's a little bit too much down, so that forearm's pointing down to the floor. So what's going to happen is, as he gets here, that right scapula raises up, and then from here, that right elbow starts to wander out. He gets the shaft a little bit steep there. Now, he does get a little bit of cup in his left wrist that he's working on, but he's got quite a strong grip, so it's a matchup, that's not too big of an issue, because he's quite strong in the left hand, he needs to get that cup. But what happens now is that right arm starts to wander out behind him, then gets the club across the line. From here, as he gets into downswing, that arm gets a little bit more behind him. He gets that shaft a little bit steep, and then often he'll come early extend, come out of it, get a little bit too much from the inside. And then that's why he talks about his start lines being a little bit too wide, too right, too left, because he's got this move of arm coming out, a little bit steep, early extend to shallow it, and then that path goes a little bit too far out to the right. And then he's got too much curvature on the ball. And obviously under the gun, we've seen a lot with Rory this year where he's struggled a little bit under pressure. Sometimes it's his putting, sometimes it's been his full swing, but we've seen a lot of second place finishes. Rory could have quite easily had a better year than Scotty Scheffler and won, a lot of events, but that technique that he's got has just caused him a few issues. So what he's been trying to do is in this takeaway position, he's been trying to get that right arm a little bit softer and what we call supinate. So that right arm, forearm is rotating out a little bit more. You can see how my thumb is twisting a little bit more. So what happens there is Rory's getting more into this position here. That softens that right arm. You can see a little bit more bend. The elbow joint here is pointing out to the ball if we had a ball there. But what it does is it pushes that scapula, that shoulder blade down. And what that allows is a little bit more stability in the shoulder. Now, if that shoulder blade gets elevated, the arm gets long, we can then move what's called the glenohumeral joint around. And what happens in the swing, we can feel instability. Whereas if we get this shoulder, it's something that Pete Cowan talks about a lot, where the shoulder blade sits down a little bit, that shoulder joint's more in a stable position. So here it's a lot more stable and less likely to move around. So Rory's trying to get this right arm in this softer position so he can get a touch flatter here. This shoulder blade staying a little bit more down so he can get that right arm in a nicer position here and not be across the line. Because when he does this, the shoulder blade's a little bit more stable. Then on the downswing, all he has to do is rotate instead of getting that position where he's across, comes down steep, early extends, gets that path a little bit too far to the right. So two main things there. First, when we're making a swing change, remember that we don't always want to see flight, or we don't always want to be too preoccupied with the outcome. And second, what Rory's doing here is he's really loading that right shoulder in the correct way. He's not quite there yet, but he will get there. He's phenomenal talent. But I don't see a lot of amateurs getting into that right position here where that shoulder blade sits down. A lot of guys have this action where they sort of chainsawing it back, or like Rory where he's too much this way, this palm's working too much down, this forearm's working too much down, and he elevates that scapula. So it's a really nice drill. You'll see Rory doing this where he gets in this nice soft position and then gets up to the top, and it really loads that shoulder joint in a really nice position. You can feel that if you do it at home, of getting in that position then up to the top, you'll feel how that shoulder sits down, and you usually get a really strong position in that right arm. So those are the two takeaways. Don't be too focused on outcome when we're making a change in swing, and watch what that right elbow does. Watch how that scapula's working. Be a huge influence on your golf game.